Absolutely. As a little girl, I remember our business community on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Way. It wasn't called that at the time, but certainly the grocery stores, dry cleaners, shoe shops, mechanics, so many. We were a self-sustained community, just like African American communities were and were across the country. As I'm learning, we were all just trying to make it on our own because we had no choice. We had no choice. And so we served one another. I remember the Jenkins family. If your family had not gotten paid a particular time and you needed groceries, they would, they would give you groceries on credit. And then next door to the Jenkins grocery was the mechanic, and he was also a Jenkins. And so, yes, and the NAACP is honoring Mrs. Jenkins, the family matriarch this year. So proud of her and her work with, again, you didn't have money to get your car fixed, and there were few cars. There was a time when there were very, very few cars in the Newtown area, but if you had one and it broke down, you would get it fixed at Jenkins Grocery, the Jenkins car mechanic. School, Booker, one of the cornerstones of our community. And when it was threatened, no, it really did close down in 1967. The Booker schools, Booker High School, and there was another school in that 67, 68 time period. Oh, did this community fight. Man, we're scrabblers too, Mr. Hearns. We just didn't take it. There was a boycott, and some 2,000 African American students stayed home. Well, I should not say stayed home. They set up freedom schools, schools in the neighborhood churches, until they brought the school board to its knees, because if there weren't students in seats, state money wasn't coming through. And when you talk about some 2,000 black students not going to school, but going to school at a church, they needed to come and to the negotiating table, and that is exactly what happened. But this is interesting too. New College, we have a small independent, some call it elite college called New College of Florida there in Sarasota. Students from New College helped to teach in those freedom schools that were set up in the churches. It was a beautiful thing to see the Booker High School students produce a documentary, not documentary short, a feature-length documentary on the impact of that school boycott and what it meant to our community.
Okay, and Gwen, would you talk about not the nostalgic days of segregation, but how this community in St. Petersburg was able to survive during that time?
As in most communities, African American communities throughout the country, we were a thriving community. Methodist Town and the Deuces, 22nd Street, had many, many businesses: hotels, cafes, dentists, 2 pharmacies, the doctor's offices, shoe repair, furniture stores. There was seamstresses and tailors, because in many instances we could not try on clothes in downtown St. Petersburg. You could buy the clothes, but you couldn't try them on. So we had quite a few people, tailors and seamstresses, who could alter the clothes for you. But there was anything you could think of that you wanted was on 22nd Street or in Methodist Town. And we had the Manhattan Casino. I mean, what? The historic Manhattan Casino. There is not a single African American jazz, blues, gospel, or any other kind of singer who did not perform at the Manhattan Casino. We had Snow Peak across the street, where if you were too young to go to the Manhattan, like I was, then you sat in the parking lot of Snow Peak and listened to the music. But also, Snow Peak was a political place, because when Stokely Carmichael came to St. Petersburg after Omali Yeshitela was jailed, he stood on the hood of a car in the parking lot of Snow Peaks with a megaphone talking to a very diverse audience about that situation. So we were vibrant, we were thriving. It was a safe, wonderful, and nurturing community within the community. But when you stepped outside of it was when you dealt with the white and colored water fountains and the white and colored restrooms and the segregated theaters and no sitting on the green benches on Central Avenue and sitting at the back of the bus. So I read a quote once that sticks with me. It said, "Civil rights, we got what we wanted, but we lost what we had." Because we did have such a strong, united community helping each other. Education was so important in our community. Church was a mainstay in our community. And when you talk about education, you got to talk about the greatest school, in the Tampa Bay area, and that's Gibbs High School. Okay? I'm a mighty, mighty gladiator. And Gibbs High was the only African American high school, and it's named after Jonathan C. Gibbs, who was the first black Secretary of Education in the state of Florida.
Right.
And we were blessed. Our school didn't close. It didn't close like Middleton and Blake. When they wanted to close Gibbs, we came out in numbers, and we prevented Gibbs from being closed. So often people think, and this is my personal opinion, that the church was actually the cornerstone, but it was the school. On Sunday, you went to all your different churches, but Monday through Friday, every black child in St. Petersburg was at Gibbs High School. So whether it was a football game or whatever the activity, the entire city turned out. So it was a time of all of the awful Jim Crow laws, but it was also a time of community and all the culture. The Tom Thumb weddings, the planting the maypole in May, and I planted the maypole in 3rd grade. You know, all of these, the fish fries, the teas when the ladies dressed up in their Sunday hats, and every church had a tea. All of the social organizations, the National Council of Negro Women, the ambassadors that Dr. Ralph Wimbish started. It was a rich, very rich community, full of history, full of pride. You know, we were entrepreneurs, and we took care of each other.
Wow. If you saw the movie Ghost, I'll just say ditto to everything that was said. I mentioned earlier that in the 1890s we had the beginning of Central Avenue, the black business district, which was also the entertainment district. And it came to be called the Harlem of the South by the 1930s and 40s. So Ella Fitzgerald visited there, and it's been said that she actually wrote a Tisket a Tasket while she was living in the Jackson House, just about 3 blocks away from Central Avenue, and she could walk down to Central Avenue from there. Ray Charles, and you probably know this story, recorded his first record actually with a little tape recorder he made in Tampa, but the name of the song was the St. Pete Blues. And Ray said he named it the St. Pete Blues because folk with money from up north knew where St. Petersburg was because of the beaches. They had no idea how to get to Tampa. So that's why he named it the St. Pete Blues. We had all of that. We had our own cotton club. Like the Cotton Club in New York, we had our own Apollo, owned by African Americans. At one time there were over 100 black-owned businesses on Central Avenue. Just imagine that. So when I would walk over to Central Avenue, if I didn't have bus fare from East Tampa, and go to the Lincoln Theater, named for Abraham Lincoln, of course, on Central Avenue, and then you go down to Cozy Corner, owned by Moses White. He sold 3 hot dogs for a quarter if you didn't have much money, but if you had a little money, you could get barbecue and well, you name it. They had it. Chicken, unlike any other. We had these black business people, and some of you know former Senator Arthenia Joyner. Grew up on Central Avenue. Her father owned the Cotton Club. And when she'd get out of school at Middleton High School, she'd go to the Cotton Club and sit over in the corner and do her homework. We have all these wonderful stories. Now, in 1912, Booker T. Washington came to Tampa. He made it his business for the last several years of his life. Every year he would visit a different state, primarily southern states. And he'd do train stops in these cities. And he stopped in Tampa, and of course he was the founder of the National Negro Business League. And he encouraged African American business owners to organize National Negro Business League chapters in their cities if they didn't have them. So that also encouraged the growth of the businesses in Tampa. But then 1967, when we had what some people call the riots, others call it the civil disturbances, 4 buildings were burned down. So there were about 12 or 13 businesses that went up in the smoke. And then Central Avenue got a negative reputation, and also we had desegregation happening in the late 60s. So people like myself, young folk who had a little bit of money, not a lot because I was a student, we started running to these white businesses that we had been forbidden to go to all our lives. We were just curious, we were just so happy. We're going over on Dale Mabry, Hillsborough Avenue, and visit these restaurants and places, and we abandoned our black businesses. They died. Segregation killed them in that way. Desegregation rather killed them. And then with the coming of the interstate, eminent domain, the land was bought.